For folks who are joining, we'll wait just a minute for everybody to get into the Zoom room, and then we'll get started. Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Doug Elmendorf, Dean of the Kennedy School. Welcome. Let me begin by saying that I hope we all took time yesterday to reflect on our gratitude to military veterans, to those who have sacrificed to protect our countries through honorable military service. We have many veterans and active duty service members here at the Kennedy School as students, staff members, or faculty members. To all of them, I want to offer my own deep appreciation and profound respect for your distinctive public service. In just over 2 months' time, the United States will have a new president, Joe Biden, and a new vice president, Kamala Harris. As I wrote in my school-wide message on Monday, this presidential election had historic importance. The election was historic in the stark contrast between the candidates. The election was historic in the unusually high turnout by US standards, although not by global standards. The election was historic in terms of the global situation and the global implications of the outcome. And the election was historic in the milestone of electing as US Vice President the first woman, and specifically the first African-American woman and first South Asian American woman. I noted in my Monday message that President George H.W. Bush offered a lesson in grace when he left the White House, telling his successor, President Bill Clinton, quote, "Your success now is our country's success. I'm rooting hard for you," unquote. In light of the role the United States plays in the world, the success of US leaders is not only the success of this country, but often the success of the world as well. Therefore, I encourage us all to follow George H.W. Bush's example and root hard for the success of the new president and vice president. When President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris take office on January 20th, they will bring with them the values they've developed and honed over many years and the experiences that have shaped their views of the world. They will also bring a large collection of people with them, hundreds and ultimately thousands of new appointees who will support the president and vice president and who will lead the departments and agencies of the executive branch of government. And the president and vice president will bring with them policy ideas culled from discussions and debates across this country and around the world this year and in previous years. Our subject for today is the policies of the Biden-Harris administration. Despite all the discussions and debates that have already occurred, many more will take place as people inside the administration and outside the administration try to shift policies in the directions they favor. We are very fortunate to have on the Kennedy School faculty many people with influential voices in the areas of policy in which they are experts. I've asked 6 of those faculty members to lead today's discussion. Of course, even with this large and distinguished panel, we will not be able to cover all of the policy areas that are crucial or go into any given policy area as much as we perhaps should. So I invite you to look out for more events hosted by the school's research centers in the coming weeks. Let me introduce our panelists very briefly and in alphabetical order. Joe Aldy is a professor of the practice of public policy. His research focuses on climate, energy, and regulatory policy, and he served as special assistant to the president for energy and environment at the beginning of the Obama administration. Nick Burns is a professor of the practice of diplomacy and international relations. He was a career foreign service officer for many years and was US ambassador to Greece and later to NATO, and was Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. Jason Furman is a professor of the practice of economic policy. Before coming to the Kennedy School 4 years ago, he was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. Juliette Kayyem is a senior lecturer in international security and an expert on crisis response and resiliency. Among her other government service, she was Assistant Secretary for Intergovernmental Affairs at the Department of Homeland Security. And Wendy Sherman is a professor of the practice of public leadership and director of the Kennedy School's Center for Public Leadership. Among many other government roles that she has filled, she was Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. And Sandra Susan Smith joined the Kennedy School faculty just this past summer. We are thrilled that she is here with us now. She is professor of criminal justice and director of our program in criminal justice policy and management, although her interests are, in fact, much broader. Please join me in welcoming these 6 distinguished faculty members. I'm going to ask each of them to offer just a few minutes of policy advice in her or his area. Then I'll ask them some questions of my own, and then I'll give you a chance to ask them some of your questions. Let us begin with Nick Burns. Nick, please.
Doug, thank you very much, and good afternoon and good evening, everybody, depending where you are. I just wanted to say at the beginning, what a pleasure it is to be here with Dean Elmendorf. He's really held us together as a school in this tumultuous year. We've faced so many challenges, and I just want to thank Doug publicly for everything he's done, and thank my colleagues, the 5 others. I'm looking forward to hearing from each of them in this process. We're all going to speak very briefly. I've been asked to speak about foreign policy challenges ahead. What do we hope will happen? What do we expect to happen? Doug, I'd say the following. First, foreign policy is going to have to begin at home. There's no question that all of us in the foreign policy community need to recognize that the biggest challenges are at home, coping with the pandemic, getting our arms around that problem and having a government that will lead us from Washington on it. Certainly the recession, which is affecting every state and every person in the country. And I would add race, the racial crisis in the United States and the need for leadership at all levels of our society. President Biden, when he is president on January 20th, 2021, is going to have to lead us forward and convince the American people that we need to be simultaneously focused at home as well as re-engaging and leading overseas. And that's going to be a tall order in some parts of the country. So Doug, my first point would be foreign policy is going to have to begin at home. Second, you're certainly going to see President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, they're going to move out and they're going to lead in the world because you've already seen them say, and in the phone calls that Joe Biden has had with our European and Asian leaders, allies over the last couple of days, he has said, we're going to rejoin the Paris Climate Change Agreement. We're going to rejoin the World Health Organization and help the rest of the world, as well as ourselves, deal with the pandemic. We're going to obviously try to assert that the United States has to be engaged after this unilateralist administration of Donald Trump. Third, we obviously need to repair our alliances. The big power differential between the United States and Russia is the fact that Russia has no allies in the world, and the United States has Canada and 28 European allies. You've already seen Joe Biden in his conversations with Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, talk about the need for us to return to NATO, return to leading the big East Asian alliances, bilateral alliances we have with Japan, South Korea, and Australia, and the development of the Quad, adding India to those 3 countries, US, Japan, and Australia, in a way to limit China's military ambitions in the Indo-Pacific. To do that, we need a strong foreign service and a strong State Department. And both Wendy and I know how weakened the State Department has become. And Wendy, I'm sure we'll talk about this. As a former member of the Career Foreign Service, I can tell you morale is at its lowest in 40 years. We do have a Harvard project underway for the last 2 years to think through how we would strengthen the Foreign Service. And we're going to announce the results of that project, our policy proposals, next Tuesday morning, November 17th. And we invite you all to be there, and we'll send out an invitation. So we've got to re-engage with allies as the big differential in power that we have with our 2 major authoritarian adversaries, Russia and China. Fourth, Doug, it brings us to China in this speed presentation. I think almost everybody, leaders in both of our political parties, would agree that the greatest challenge we're going to face overseas in the next decade, in addition to climate, will be an ever assertive China. And we need to get the balance right here. And I'm not sure the United States has the balance right. Both political parties have almost come together on a nearly entirely competitive strategy with China. I agree on most of it. Compete on trade, compete on values, compete to maintain the American military position that we have held for 75 years in the Indo-Pacific. But if there's no cooperation part of that, if we don't have any balance in the American policy towards Beijing, it means we won't be working together on the pandemic. We should be. We should be working together on this, especially on distribution of the vaccine. We've got to work together on climate change. We're the world's number 1 and 2, as Joe will tell you, carbon emitters. And we should go back to what Barack Obama did so successfully in 2015, and Wendy was part of this, in working with the Chinese government on the Paris Agreement. 2 more issues, Doug. Certainly trade's going to be really difficult, and I'm not a trade specialist. Jason, I'm sure, will know more about this, but figuring out where we're heading on trade after Donald Trump almost single-handedly dismantled much of the multilateral trade regime that was built up over decades. And Doug, you'll have a lot of views on this. It's going to be a contested issue in the Democratic Party, and it will be in the Republican Party. And in my conversations recently with Europeans and Japanese, they're not quite sure what's possible. Could you reconstruct the Trans-Pacific Partnership? The Europeans don't think that a big trade deal between the EU and the United States is politically possible for them. So what are the goals on trade? And finally, Doug, 6th, we need to return to leadership of the democratic world. And we need to return to have some exposure to the issue of the United States leading on human rights. We've been silent on Hong Kong, and you've just seen another Chinese measure yesterday to essentially strangle the democratic rights of the people of Hong Kong. We've been silent on the Uyghurs. I'm talking about the President of the United States, Donald Trump, silent on that moral issue. We have been silent on the attempted murder of Alexei Navalny and silent on Belarus. And it's always a struggle to know the balance in foreign and defense policy. When do you assert our military interests? When do you assert our human rights interests? But to be silent as the most important democratic country in the world, we have to find our voice. And that extends to me, because we're an immigrant nation, to returning to legal immigration and seeing it as an economic and moral strength of the country, and returning to refugee admittance. In 2019 and 20, at the turn of the year, we didn't admit a single refugee into the United States, first time in half a century. And that denies who we are as a people. Those are 6 challenges. There are many more, but I know from Sandra and Juliette, Jason, Joe, and Wendy, we're going to learn a lot more. And I'm looking forward to their comments. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick. It's a wonderful start to this event. Jason, would you like to pick up from here, please?
Great. Thanks so much for including me in this discussion. The COVID pandemic is the worst shock to the US economy in my lifetime, probably in a century. The economic policy response to the COVID shock, at least initially, was the largest economic response to anything. The result of that is we're now in what looks like the 3rd worst of the 12 post-war recessions. We're no longer in historically unprecedented territory economically. It's no longer a Great Depression, but the 3rd worst out of 12 recessions is consistent with it still being quite bad. The headline unemployment rate is 6.9%, but the unemployment rate, if you adjust for some unusual things that have happened in labor markets, is more like 8.4%. The unemployment rate for Black Americans is double digits and unacceptably high, especially, but for everyone. A lot of the most urgent things that need to be done should have been done in July when the initial round of relief expired. Insofar as it wasn't done in July, it should be done this month and shouldn't wait for January. There are some negotiations around that I have put my ideas up for them in the Wall Street Journal today. You can read them in more detail. I'm a little bit worried as to whether or not they'll happen. If they don't, then job one for President Biden will be economic relief and fiscal stimulus to both protect families from the downturn in the economy and also put the economy on a better path forward for economic growth, a combination of transfers like unemployment insurance and additional funding for states. And of course, containing the virus, which is the most important thing we can do for our economy, our society, and our lives. Even if the economy fully repairs itself from COVID by the end of 2021, which I think would be very optimistic, but even if it did, we would still have deep problems. Inequality has been growing since around 1980. Productivity growth has been lower since the 1970s. And you've seen a withdrawal from the workforce of men between the ages of 25 and 54, prime age men, and a plateauing of women's entry into the workforce at a rate that's even lower. Those deep structural problems in some ways are going to be the most important to address. They're also the hardest to address in that there are some administrative tools that the administration could do through executive orders, through regulations to make improvements in all of those areas. But the biggest improvements would require legislation. I'll just list them very quickly now, what I'd make some of the priorities, and we can talk more in the Q&A. Investments in children would be my number one priority. That has the highest rate of return of anything we know we can do in the economy, whether that's preschool, childcare, child allowance. Second would be infrastructure, especially green infrastructure, green investment. Third would be openness. Openness is in the form of immigration, in the form of trade. And finally, our overall fiscal system would need to be redressed as part of that, with higher taxes on high-income households as part of a bigger tax reform. That's, of course, very difficult depending on the outlook for the Senate, which is to say that these problems have grown over 40 years. They're not going to be solved in 2 years. You need to get a start on solving them, but also build the case for the bigger solutions that you'll need to continue and follow through on.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much, Jason. You, like Nick, have enough issues we could fill an hour and a half just with those, but we will press on. Sandra, can you proceed now, please?
Hey, thank you, Doug. So President-elect Biden's top priorities for his new administration are to fight COVID-19 and climate change, and also to promote racial equity and economic recovery. When pressed to consider what I would do now if I were in Biden's shoes, here's my response. I would significantly reduce the number of inmates in federal prisons now. To help explain why, let me first tell you about Patrick Jones. Mr. Jones was a 49-year-old Black man from Texas who was 13 years into a 27-year sentence. His offense? He was found in possession of 23 grams of crack and 21 grams of powder cocaine. Almost certainly these drugs were for sale or distribution and not personal use. Still, it is difficult not to be affronted by this sentence, which, even with Mr. Jones' lengthy priors, felt spectacularly punitive. It is worth noting that the severity of his sentence can be traced back to the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which had as a co-author then Senator Joe Biden. This is what punishment looks like in the age of retribution, especially so for poor men of color. Driven by the same sense of injustice, Mr. Jones spent years trying to get his sentence reduced. During his latest attempt, he petitioned the courts for consideration under the First Step Act, which gave relief to inmates who had been convicted of nonviolent drug offenses. He learned back in February of this year that his request had been denied. He planned to appeal. 1 month later, Mr. Jones was dead. He was the first federal prisoner to have been taken by COVID-19. For me, Mr. Jones' situation is a reminder of just how much we have forgotten or perhaps disregarded our principles about how justice in the US should be meted out. As we have learned from the National Academy of Sciences report on the causes and consequences of mass incarceration, proportionality, parsimony, citizenship, and social justice, they all matter. These principles should be a part of any deliberation to establish fair and just penal policies and practices. For the past 50 years, however, they've largely been ignored. And so it is with these principles in mind that I argue that Biden's term should start by significantly reducing the number of inmates in federal prisons. Why this specifically? If fighting COVID-19 is a priority, then certainly focusing at least some significant attention on incarceration facilities makes good sense. We know from the following, from a recent report commissioned by the National Commission on COVID-19 and Criminal Justice, that almost all of the top clusters of cases in the US have been in incarceration facilities. The rate of cases reported by state and federal prisons is more than 4 times greater than confirmed cases per 100,000 US residents. And the prison COVID-19 mortality rate is 110% higher than the same national mortality rate, so the COVID-19 mortality rate for the US population. Why? Simply because of overcrowding and overcapacity, unsanitary conditions, and poor healthcare. To save lives and achieve more just and equitable outcomes, we must get these facilities under capacity. For state and federal prisons, however, relatively little has been done to release prisoners on a large scale. Few have been let go. Jails, it's a different story, but not for the prisons. So with principles of justice in mind, federal prisons, which are actually under President-elect Biden's purview, should be required to do far more. They should do so for the sake of proportionality. Punishments should fit the crimes. For Mr. Jones, this principle had already been violated when he was sentenced to 27 years in prison, the result of unrelentingly cruel sentencing policies. By not responding to the COVID threat, however, Mr. Jones' sentence was in effect increased to death. He has been one of roughly 175,000 inmates to contract the virus and one of roughly 1,300 inmates to die from it. They should do so for the sake of parsimony. Punishments should not exceed the minimum needed to achieve its legitimate purpose. If the courts had parsimony in mind when sentencing Mr. Jones, there's a good chance that he likely would not have been in prison petitioning for relief when he contracted the virus and died. The severity of his sentence put him at risk, as it did for thousands of others. They should do so for the cause of citizenship. Imprisonment should not violate individuals' fundamental status as members of society. But with such cavalier disregard for individuals who have been incarcerated in prisons during the pandemic, it is easy to see how under such conditions, they might come to believe that they are not true and valued members of society, that in a very real way, their lives do not matter. They should do so with social justice in mind. This is my final point. Carceral institutions should not be instruments of further injustice. Jail and prison inmates are disproportionately Black and Latino, they're disproportionately male, they're disproportionately poor, and and these individuals are at far greater risk of having pre-existing conditions. And because of excessively long prison sentences, a growing proportion of prison inmates are also elderly. For these reasons, a disproportionate number of inmates are vulnerable to severe illness and death. It will come as a surprise to no one that Mr. Jones had pre-existing health conditions, which put him at risk of severe disease and death. Prison officials knew this, as Mr. Jones struggled with a persistent cough for several days before eventually succumbing. It is unconscionable to knowingly hold individuals who are susceptible to severe illness and death in facilities where overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, and poor healthcare converge to create a petri dish-like set of conditions for disease spread. But these are the conditions that the overwhelming majority of prison inmates now face. So with these principles in mind, I suggest that federal prisons should be required to release many, if not most, of the following. And remember that jails have done this to a great extent, reducing their populations by on average 30%. Releasing the elderly, individuals with pre-existing conditions, those being held on nonviolent offenses, immigrants imprisoned for illegal re-entry offenses under punitive policies put in place by Jeff Sessions, and individuals who have already served 20 years or more of their sentences. In so doing, the Biden administration can send a strong message, a strong signal to the nation about the president-elect's commitment to fighting against COVID-19, fighting for racial equity and bonus, fighting for more just policies in the criminal legal realm. Given what we know about effective sentencing practices abroad, and given what we have learned from our decarceration efforts here at home, there really is no compelling reason not to do so, and at least 4 reasons why we should. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandra. And now turning to another set of important topics, Juliette Kayyem, would you pick up the tale?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. We've been complaining before we got on that some of our internet is not great. So I do, in all good Homeland Security crisis management fashion, I have a redundancy if anything happens, but something's going on in Cambridge. To the Dean and to the community and to my colleagues, it is fantastic to be here. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity about the path forward in Homeland Security generally, and in COVID response more specifically. So I'm just going to touch on a few key themes that the president-elect will inherit as regards Homeland Security, and then obviously what COVID response looks like. So obviously there's going to be sort of undoing of I'll just be of the messiness, of the ugliness. So things like the Muslim ban, separation of children, try to get the children together, DACA. So some of those sort of relief or those easing aspects that he has already stated that have come through the Department of Homeland Security, mostly on the immigration and border enforcement front, but also some of the other challenges that we've seen with the department. So that gets to my second point. So if the first point is stop the harm, and I'm not going to be agnostic about that, stop the harm. The second is going to be right-size the department. So those of you who have taken my class or have, in the past, the department was formed, or the idea of Homeland Security was formed after 9/11, essentially to focus on counterterrorism. The course correction occurred in 2005 after Hurricane Katrina sort of showed people like me and others that a nation, to focus on stopping 19 terrorists from getting on 4 airplanes could not save an American city, an American, predominantly African-American city from drowning. So you started to see in the second term of Bush and the 2 terms of Obama, talk of all hazards, and in particular, a focus on 4 borderless threats. So the different, the Homeland Security sort of, it deals with state-sponsored threats, but the ones that we worry about the most are, of course, climate change or climate disaster response, cybersecurity, radicalization, and pandemics. I'll get to pandemics last. So what happened in the Trump administration is it went to a singular focus. I don't even call it immigration. I call it border enforcement. Immigration is much more than border enforcement. It's about flows, the kind of things that that Jason thinks about what kind of workforce do you want for the future. That's immigration. This was solely border enforcement issues, in particular our southern border. So I think what you'll see is a right sizing. So instead of any individual policy, you're going to just see, hopefully, a department reconceptualize itself back to where it was second term Bush and 2 terms of Obama. Many of you do not like the policies coming out of the department. I get that, but there's no abolishing ICE. We will have to have immigration enforcement. There's no abolishing the department. We need an agency that is focused on essentially defense and on response capabilities, and that's the right sizing that you'll see. The third area, just quickly, because I want to get to COVID, is of course where does the hate go? You will see a focus on white supremacy. I have of the view that when you don't have this amplified at senior levels of government, i.e. check the Twitter feed today, that a lot of it will go away. Doesn't mean it's people all of a sudden become nice, but it means it's shamed. So you are going to start to see shaming happen again, which is a fantastic thing. That's what a country like ours should do. Nazism didn't die after World War II, but its adherents were also sufficiently shamed that they did not have a forum in politics. And that is, you will see a focus, a transition to focus on white supremacy. There will still be hate crimes. There will probably be more in the short term, but I am quite confident that without without an amplifier for some of the stuff that we've seen, that this will be something that's manageable. I think in risk reduction, I don't think about risk elimination. I want reduction here. And now let me end with the one thing and the only thing that matters right now, as every panelist has essentially said, we are not at recovery. It is not at all clear that we can flatten the curve in time. We have 11 states that are over 15% hospitalization of COVID. Why does that matter? Someone like me starts to worry at 5%. When your hospitalization bed rate is at 5% for COVID, you're going to start to see a big shift up. We have, we're all red now. This is now a response. This is now a pandemic that has no epicenter, and the pressures on our response capabilities are going to be that much harder because of supply chain issues, because our hospitals, it is not at all clear that our hospital system can sustain it. And we are looking at probably 300,000 deaths, if I'm just looking at numbers here, 300,000 deaths by the time Biden takes over, if we're lucky. On January 20th. In the short term, the best that the president-elect can do, and he's certainly doing it, we've seen 2 red states move to mask mandates since the election. So there is a role for the bully pulpit, is to try to get masking, tell us not to get together at Thanksgiving or Christmas, but he will inherit an emergency, a crisis like no other. And so that will be trying to enforce mask mandates. There's a governance issue and a federalism issue, but it will get tougher to do interstate travel. You will not be able to get on airplanes. The airlines are dying for it. You will start to see it look a little bit tougher because we don't have that many tools. I think quick testing will come on board to get our schools back open, but I am talking to you as a mother. I am not optimistic about my high school kids and the spring now looking at these numbers. Invocation of the Defense Production Act to make sure our supply chain holds together in terms of the needs of our hospitals. And fourth, obviously a focus on vaccine distribution. Well, this is great news all around on the vaccine. Well, there'll probably be others coming. It's a 2-shot vaccine. And cold storage. That is a distribution problem. And it has to be equitable and fair and distributed to communities in an order that makes sense to them. We know who goes first. They always go first. Our healthcare workers and our military and our first responders should always go first. Who goes 5th, 6th, and 7th with a rolling distribution plan is a challenge. A vaccine never saved a life, only a vaccination has. So you are going to see a drill down on what they inherit from the Trump administration, which is very military focused and not totally desirable, to one that's more integrated with our public health agencies. But there's no reporters ask me, are we ignoring national security issues, or are we neglecting national security issues because of COVID? There is no other national security issue. It is the only one that matters. Our economy won't come back, our strength won't come back, our resiliency won't come back. We've got to get this under control. And if I sound anxious, it is because I am looking at these numbers right now. So my last words are: wear a mask, stay at home, and cancel Thanksgiving. Thanks.
Thank you, Juliette. I think we've had a collection of bracing comments, but also comments that show us things that we can do individually and collectively to make a better world in the future. Joe Aldy, would you go next, please?
Great, thanks, Doug, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. Virtually every form of economic activity or personal behavior has some impact on the global climate. And climate change will affect every corner of our society. Seriously combating climate change will require a whole of government approach to the problem to ensure that we mitigate risk throughout every sector of our economy and every part of our society. President-elect Biden set the most ambitious climate change goals of any major party candidate for president in our history. He called for decarbonizing the power sector by 2035 and for net zero emissions of greenhouse gases economy-wide by 2050. To make meaningful progress on these goals, let me note the three types of actions the president-elect and his team should pursue. First are the actions the White House can implement immediately. This includes the personnel in the White House and throughout all of the agencies who will be coordinating, developing, and implementing the president's climate agenda. Related to personnel is the organization of the White House process, perhaps through a National Climate Council or a task force of all cabinet agencies that would drive action and ensure accountability for delivering on the president's goals. This includes executive orders that guide agencies in interpreting policy, especially, I think, in reversing the deregulatory agenda of the past 4 years. It also includes bilateral agreements through head of state meetings that will signal renewed partnerships on climate change with other countries around the world. It also includes using the president's bully pulpit and that of major cabinet secretaries, including those we don't typically associate with the issue of climate change, such as the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of Treasury, to focus the country's attention on what we can do to combat climate change. Second are the actions the executive branch can implement through the regulatory process. The White House can direct agencies, EPA, Departments of Energy, the Department of Transportation, and others to pursue new climate change regulations and to roll back Trump-era rules. But this will require time to go through the administrative process, and there are some uncertainties about their fate when they're subject to judicial review. The White House could also try to be more creative in how they engage independent regulatory commissions, whether it's the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission or the whole suite of alphabet soup in the financial regulatory space to try to get new energy and financial regulations that address climate change throughout the government. Third are the actions the White House can pursue by working with others, the states, business leaders, but most importantly, Congress. Now, there's greater uncertainty about how to work with Congress, especially with the Senate up in the air, but the climate payoffs could be quite considerable, and I think are going to be really critical for delivering on the president-elect's climate agenda. This could include extensive clean energy and climate resilient infrastructure investments in a COVID economic recovery package. It could also include the regular budget process, as well as for the potential for legislation that would provide new authorities for regulating or pricing greenhouse gas emissions. Let me give one concrete example of what a Biden White House could do early in the administration to guide and operationalize these efforts along each of these three types of actions. President Biden could adopt a carbon price benchmark. This is similar to what many major corporations have used, what they term internal carbon prices, to guide their strategy and investment decisions. A carbon price benchmark, say initially set at $50 per ton, would reflect the benefits of reducing the pollution causing climate change. President Biden would ensure that decision makers across the government rigorously consider the benefits of mitigating climate change in every action they undertake. This benchmark could guide the setting of department-wide emission goals akin to their efforts in 2009 and 2015. This would reorient budget planning and redirect the management of vehicle fleets, buildings, and other assets to account for climate change. The carbon price benchmark would enable more ambitious regulations by monetizing their climate benefits, and the White House could direct agencies to change their procurement rules to require government contractors to adopt their own internal carbon prices, which they would then need to converge on the government benchmark over time. This could amplify the carbon price throughout the private sector even before we could use legislation to price carbon. Speaking of legislation, the White House could champion congressional action, whether it's subsidies for clean energy in an economic recovery package, a national clean energy standard, or a carbon tax, which is my favorite, but I will acknowledge the political perils of trying to achieve that through Congress. You could support any of those so long as the carbon benchmark justifies the cost of doing so. And that would ensure that what we do in climate change policies are making sound investments on behalf of the American taxpayer. The $50 benchmark reflects the global benefits of reducing carbon dioxide pollution, and that would signal a renewed commitment to working with partners around the world and establish our expectation that they would reciprocate by accounting for their emissions' global impacts when they ramp up their ambition, and as we all work together as we try to implement the vision laid out from the 2015 Paris Agreement. The expectations for immediate climate action must confront the challenge that new regulations, legislation, and international agreements take time. But by establishing, I think, a carbon price benchmark, President Biden would initiate the ambitious whole of government and whole of economy approach that's necessary to address climate change. I look forward to the rest of our conversation today. Thanks, Doug.
Thank you so much, Joe. And that brings us to Wendy Sherman. Wendy, please.
Thank you, Doug. And it's always difficult to be the last speaker, particularly when everyone who has spoken before you has been so eloquent, so precise, and really laid on the table an extraordinary agenda. And I'm very grateful and flattered to be part of this extraordinary group. I want to bring us back to some first principles as we think about these things. 2020 and 2021 is not 2016. We are in an entirely different world than when President Trump became president of the United States. And not just because of his administration and his actions, but because of things that have occurred in the world. COVID is obviously the most evident for all of us in our everyday lives. But fundamentally, over a long arc of history, as Jason pointed out, we've been heading in the wrong direction. The gap between the rich and the poor has grown ever larger. Technology has moved ever faster. When the printing press came about, it was a 40, 50-year transition. When the Industrial Revolution happened, it was a many decades transition. With technology today, we are talking about a decade of transition, which means that many people who had jobs do not have them anymore. It means that as climate presses upon us and there are changes, we have climate migration. We have people who are leaving their homes not because of more traditional conflicts, because they can't live in their communities anymore and they have to go somewhere else. The United States imprisons more people than almost anybody else in the world, except maybe Iran per capita. We have changed in this world in many ways, and the phenomena in our own country is a phenomena that is worldwide. There are people listening to this discussion today who are not Americans. And one of the things that I think our students learned at the beginning of this semester is that disparities, this sense that some people have and some people have not, is a worldwide phenomena. And that worldwide phenomena leads to an immense challenge of leadership. How to, in fact, have people take personal responsibility, which just happened in our election. The New York Times reported today greater participation than in a century. That is a spectacular use of individual and personal power. We have to use the power in our communities, which we saw as Latasha Brown, one of our tremendous Hauser leaders and women in public policy leaders, worked to make sure Black voters mattered. When we've had many of our alumni work to make sure that Latino voices are heard, that everybody goes to the polls, that we get 100% registration of our students to take that personal possibility. We've seen advocacy in our communities, which we have to encourage and increase. As Joe points out, climate cannot be solved except by our everyday habits. Juliette pointed out, unless we wear masks, we are lost. We will see 400,000 deaths, not 300,000 deaths. So we each can do things individually and use that power in our communities. We know we talk about tri-sector leadership these days. It's really quad leadership, to pull on something Nick was saying about what we've done in the Indo-Pacific, but it's true. It's individual, it's civil society, it's public institutions and governments, and it is business. We will not get to the public good that each of our speakers have discussed without each of those parts of our society coming together. A last couple of comments, and then want to leave it open to questions. And I'm certainly happy to talk about anything that's going on in the world, but Nick gave us a great introduction on the challenges, so I don't want to repeat it. When Biden made his opening remarks just to re-emphasize. He said that America cannot be about the example of our power. We are still the most powerful military on the face of the earth. We are still the largest economy, though being challenged on the face of the earth. We are still, though hanging on some days, the greatest democracy. But we have to be about the power of our example. You've heard from all of these speakers today what that means, what that example can mean going forward. But I want to caution all of us that it takes time. We teach our students, I teach public policy design and delivery, as does Juliette, and has everybody here in one fashion or another. It's always an iterative process. As John Lewis said, it is that great arc of history. It is not linear. So I hope that we all give the president-elect and our extraordinary vice president-elect, who has made history that I've worked for pretty much all of my life to break those glass ceilings for women. And I'm so thrilled, and now includes a woman of color as well, that we give them space and time to put the personnel in place, because we have hollowed out agencies and departments, that we give them time to put the plans that were in the campaign into operation, and that we all remember that the responsibility is not just theirs, it is each of ours. I'm going to stop there, Doug.
Thank you so much, Wendy, and thank you to all of you for such really stirring comments. Let me just ask a few questions, and then we'll open this up for questions from the very large crowd of people who have gathered today. Sandra, let me start with you, if I might. You mentioned Joe Biden's role in authoring some of the tough on crime bills of the 80s and 90s. Kamala Harris was a prosecutor earlier in her career. How do you think their views may have evolved over time, and what experiences or developments in the world might have caused those views to change, and how does that fit into the specific item that you highlighted and other changes that they might push to make in their term in our criminal justice system?
So thank you for that question. I think that's a great question. So my sense is that, at least where Biden is concerned, we might expect to see more progress on decarceration. Under Obama, from I would say between 2011 and 2013, basically rates of incarceration in federal prisons started to flatten, and then from 2013 moving forward, it declined significantly, and it continued to decline in the Trump years. So over this period of time between 2013 and 2019, we've seen a 30% reduction. So that at least that started under the Obama-Biden administration, under their leadership. And so my sense is that there is a desire to, in some ways, make up for past mistakes, to rectify past harms. There is a way that we could indirectly associate the death of Mr. Jones to policies that Biden put into place. And I think that there is a desire on his part to make changes that will produce much better outcomes to decarcerate. My sense is too that, given the current moment, there's going to be some amount of attention paid to criminal justice reform, and it's going to be unavoidable. I mean, this is an issue that many people across the country care deeply about because of what has happened over the past 4 to 5, 6 months. It's hard to kind of avoid this topic, even if they might want to. I think the issue that they're going to face is how to manage the push for greater police accountability, the push for a desire on the part of some, maybe a minority, but a significant minority, to defund police, to shift resources away from police and to communities. I think they're going to struggle to deal with that particular issue. Biden has already said that his preference would be to support police more, to add more funding and then add training, et cetera. I think that will be a problem for many. And I think as a result, he might actually in some ways alienate a lot of people, because some of what we imagine are the roots of the problems that we've been seeing over the past few decades is racism. And unless you do something to address the fact, to one, be very clear that that is a part of the problem, and to seek to address that problem, I think folks will believe that he's not gone far enough, and certainly would not have gone far enough to rectify some of the problems that he's created with the policies he supported in the past. With Vice President-elect Harris, I think that time will tell. My sense is that she has moved to the left since becoming senator. I would like to see more about what she's about with regards to criminal justice policies. But my sense is that they really do have to be careful how they toe the line, because while there's a push among some to want a real shift in policy, there's a push among many to maintain the status quo.
Thank you very much, Sandra. So my next question is, I think, is for Joe and Jason. As you both know, one of the concerns that's often expressed about policies to slow climate change or to protect the environment in other ways is that such policies will reduce people's incomes, or in the strongest way of putting it, will kill jobs. How legitimate is that concern? How should people think about the connection between economic growth and prosperity and protecting our environment from climate change and other factors?
Maybe Joe, you go first, and I'll correct you.
Okay, that sounds good. I look forward to that, Jason. So I think a lot of this gets to how we think about the policy design, Doug, about who bears some of the costs of our efforts to mitigate emissions. We have across the country some industries that are quite carbon intensive and others are very carbon lean. We have some regions of the country that are more carbon intensive than others. And so anything we do, whether it's a regulation, a carbon tax, any kind of policy that is going to start to discourage the use of carbon-based fossil fuels is going to have disproportionate and adverse economic impacts. And so one question, of course, is how you drive that transition. One thing that we've seen is that by subsidizing alternatives to fossil fuels over the last, well, dates back really to some of the policies in the 1980s, but really effectively over the past decade or so, the subsidies for solar and the subsidies of wind have helped drive down their cost a lot. That's going to make it cheaper as we go through further the decarbonization of the power sector, so that we don't pass on as high a cost in terms of higher, say, utility rates as we try to lower the emissions of the power sector. If we were to use a policy like a carbon tax, we could do something like a cap and trade program in which we auction off the allowances. Either one of those mechanisms raise revenues that can be used in a way that you can target to meet some of your concerns about the disproportionate impact and burden of the cost of this transformation of the energy foundation of our economy. You could direct some of the dollars, say, to coal mining communities as we continue to consume less coal as a part of the decarbonization path. You could direct some of the monies, say, to lower income households. We've seen this, for example, a number of other countries have done this as they have implemented a carbon tax. Even if we were to just say, take all the revenues and just write a per capita dividend check. We've got a group, originally some conservative leaders, former Republican elder statesmen advocating for such a carbon tax in which all the money is just returned to everybody who has a social security number in America. That would probably end up making the lower 70% of the income distribution better off, that they would get more income back from those checks than what they'd have to pay in terms of higher energy bills and higher costs of their goods and services. So a lot of this is, there's clearly no doubt that we're trying to change the energy foundation of our economy. That's going to create winners and losers. There's ways we can use this policy design, I think, that can actually help address some of the most severe adverse impacts that also I think will be critical when we think about the necessary political economy to get a broad enough coalition to support climate policy going forward. So with that, let me turn it over to Jason to correct me.
So I agree with everything Joe said. Let me just put it in slightly broader terms. there's this idea out there that dealing with climate change is an economic opportunity, a way to create jobs, a way to create growth. I think that's the wrong way to think about it. If carbon dioxide emissions didn't warm the planet, we would not, as a jobs and growth program, be trying to reduce them, trying to sequester them in the bottom of the ocean and all of that. That would be a bad way to grow our economy and to create jobs. It is an incredibly worthwhile and incredibly important thing to do because of the problems caused by those carbon emissions and what they're going to do to our planet and our future, including the future of our economy. So this isn't, you shouldn't think of this as an opportunity. You should think of it as having some downsides. The second thing, though, is those downsides are relatively small. The negative impact on growth, I think, is very small compared to the positive benefits of dealing with it. And if you structure the compensation correctly and well, it can be a positive thing, net for the majority of people, even if it's a more concentrated cost. For example, a carbon tax would have that on people at the very top. The third is there is always a temptation for advocates to argue that my thing is so good for the economy, it's going to help everyone, and to not talk about costs and trade-offs. And I think the danger of that is not just that it sort of goes slightly against the way I think about things analytically and is slightly analytically, annoying to me, but it will actually lead you to not compensate people who are going to have to pay more in electricity. Or it will lead you to a policy that puts more money in wind and solar, which I love, but doesn't do anything to raise the cost of electricity. So it doesn't tell people that they need to do more things to reduce their use of electricity. Or even worse, doesn't end up happening because the people who do lose out from the policy realize it, know it, and block it. Admitting that up front and figuring out how to help certain regions of the country, certain people who are adversely affected, can help you get it done. So in summary, I think there are some trade-offs. The trade-offs are small and manageable and very much worthwhile. But I think if you deny them, you're going to end up either doing too little on climate change, doing too little to compensate the people who are hurt, or even worse, you may end up doing nothing because you get stuck.
Thank you both very much. I have one last question myself before we go to the floor, and this is for Wendy and Nick. Our colleague Joe Nye wrote, I think earlier this week, that quote, Donald Trump may have despised international institutions, but his presidency has reminded the world of the importance of effective and resilient ones, unquote. So Nick, of course, you were the US ambassador to our most important longstanding alliance with the other NATO countries. Wendy, you were the lead negotiator for the Iran nuclear deal with a collection of our close allies. So you both have focused considerably in your work on the relationships with allies, relationships in international institutions. And Nick, you touched on this in your comments earlier. Can you say a little more about how you see the challenge that President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris face, but also offer advice for how they can go about trying to strengthen those international alliances and institutions?
Wendy, you should go first.
Okay, so clearly, President-elect Biden intends to re-engage with the world. He's already said that he's going to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement, a multilateral agreement, that he's not going to leave the World Health Organization. So he's already signaled quite strongly, I'm going to re-engage in the world. But I want to be clear. It is, as I said before, the world is not where it was in 2016. So our European allies, who are clearly the most important to us, as Nick pointed out, NATO is just a staggeringly important institution. All institutions are imperfect, even the Harvard Kennedy School, but nonetheless, it is a security institution that we would create if we did not have it. It's going to take us some time to rebuild our relationship, and I think that the president-elect will want to rebuild those back better as well. What I might call sort of a slightly more muscular multilateralism, where we expect more of each other because the challenges in front of us are so great. I think that President Trump has taken a very bilateral and transactional relationship to the world. It's how he understands business, how he did business as a developer. I think to do security, takes a different kind of approach. It takes understanding the entire puzzle of the globe, all the different points of leverage. We know that we are stronger economically. Jason can certainly speak to this. When we work with Europe, we are the largest trading bloc when we work together to make things happen in the world. And we have a lot of issues that we have to resolve. To a point that Nick made earlier and Jason mentioned as well, we're not going to get back to multilateral trade agreements anytime soon because we have internal structural issues that we have to deal with in the first instance. But you're going to see President Biden, a Vice President Harris reach out to the world. And let's remember two very critical things. President Biden knows everybody in the world. He already has relationships. People have already begun talking to him in appropriate ways, not in inappropriate ways. We only have one president at a time, whether you like the president or not, we have one at a time, but he knows everybody. So that's a big plus. Senator Harris has come to know a lot of people in the world as well. But secondly, and equally importantly, to build on something Nick, I'm sure will say even more about, the transition team is working with an intensity that I have not seen before. And Nick and I have both been part of multiple transitions in the past to fill slots in advance so that the hollowing out of the State Department, the Pentagon, the intelligence agencies, USAID, Commerce, Treasury, Justice, everybody gets filled as quickly as possible, because Joe Biden alone, Kamala Harris alone certainly cannot get all of the job done. We want Americans to fan out around the world to not only lead, but as importantly, to listen. Over to Ambassador Burns.
It's always hard to follow Wendy because she's so brilliant as a communicator and thinker. But I'll just add a couple of things to what she said. And Doug, you asked the right question. It's a good Kennedy School question for our students. We've got to reform the basic international institutions that comprise the so-called international system. Many of them are 70, 75 years old. We've certainly got to reform the World Trade Organization and get China's relationship with it straight. Despite my agreement that we should go back into the WHO in the middle of the pandemic, that's an institution that didn't perform well at the beginning of the pandemic. And I'm not a climate expert, and Joe and Jason and others are, but certainly I think all of us hope that the UN organization of this can be focused and demanding, and that we do better than 2030 targets. So I agree with the need to reform, Doug. On NATO, I just say this. Wendy's right when she says we can't go back to 2016, and certainly Joe Biden and Kamala Harris know that. And we've got to point NATO towards 2030. So what's the agenda? We're just about to experience a profound transformation in military technology. As AI and quantum computing and biotech are militarized, will NATO be able to make that transition? We know the US will. We know that Japan will. We know that Australia and India will. I'm not so sure about the European allies, about the lack of capital investments towards that end. They've got to be better, the European allies, on deployability, meaning having the assets to be able to move troops. They've got to get a policy on 5G, and Europe is fundamentally disunited right now on 5G, but Australia, Japan, India, the UK, and the US, all on one side saying no to Huawei, but the Europeans debating it. And you know, I was a very vocal opponent of Donald Trump for the last 4 years. There was a kernel of truth in what he was doing. The allies need to spend more on defense. What he missed, however, was the trend line. Since Putin's annexation of Crimea in 2014, every ally has experienced a real increase in their defense budgets. And by 2024, 3/4 of the allies, 4 years from now, will be over the 2% floor. So instead of pushing, but also welcoming the change, Trump acted like nothing was happening. And actually the trend line is good. I'll just end by saying, some of us were at the Munich Security Conference the last time Joe Biden was there, 2019. He gave a big speech from the floor, lots of people in the hall. It was a ringing defense of allies, that we shouldn't want to be alone in the world, partners. that we should work with the world and be one of the leaders of the world, or if not the leader. And at the end of the speech, he said, there's another America out there that deeply believes in the international engagement of the United States. He said, we'll be back. And as a passionate supporter of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, I'm just glad that we're going to have a president who can lead us forward again. That gives me some hope.
Thank you very much, Nick. And thanks to all of you. We will now go to the floor. And our first question is from our colleague, Francine and Mary Faulkner. Francine, please. It's good to see your name, Francine. We would love to see your face, if you would, and if you can unmute yourself and hear your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much for taking my question. Given how China is insidiously working their way into vulnerable countries through loans for infrastructure and other projects in these countries, and then they can't pay them back, especially in places like Africa, and then China is taking over resources within these countries, China's moving into a position of global power. What advice do you have for the Biden administration to address this insidious takeover, and what support from the US needs to be put in place to protect especially African countries? Thank you.
Thank you, Francine. I don't know if Nick or Wendy would like to take that. Please, Wendy.
I got it. Excellent question, Francine. One of the things that's already happened is Africans are responding differently to China than they once did. I think originally when China came into Africa, Africa saw, a route to development, a route to building highways and buildings and hospitals. But they found out exactly what you pointed out, that those loans came with a huge price. Those loans also came with Chinese workers who didn't share the technology or the competencies or the capabilities with the African people themselves. And so countries didn't get any technology transfer. They didn't get any capacity building. They certainly didn't get any forgiveness on the loans. So for many African countries, they are now quite more skeptical. And as you pointed out, in many cases, China took resources out of Africa and didn't put anything back into African countries. There's not one story because Africa is made up of many countries. It's not just one country, it's many. But nonetheless, the points you make have a basis for validity for sure. The Biden-Harris administration has a very sophisticated view of China. And some of my other colleagues up here have mentioned some of that. It is first and foremost to make sure that we invest in our own economy so we can compete with China. Invest in our infrastructure, invest in 5G, in quantum computing, in AI, building that green economy that creates new jobs and high-tech kind of industry for the future so that we can compete with China. So that's something we have to do. President-elect Biden has indicated we're ready to challenge and confront China where we must in the South China Sea, in trade rules around the world, in enforcement on human rights. And there are a few places where we will have to look to cooperate. And that's already been mentioned by others around the pandemic, around climate. We will not solve the climate crisis without China and without other big emitters around the world. And so we'll have to find, so this will be a very complex, very sophisticated, nuanced approach to China, but a very clear-eyed and a very tough one. In this measure, whether you're a Democrat, a Republican, or independent, we all know what's coming at us, what's already come, and we have to be ready to take it on. And I think you will see a Biden-Harris administration do that. And we have some phenomenal experts at the Kennedy School who know even much more about this than I do. And I'd urge you to watch them, read them, and listen to what they have to say.
Thank you very much, Wendy, and thank you, Francine, for the question. Our next question comes from Gopal Nadadur. Gopal, please.
Thank you very much, Dean, and thank you, everyone. It's a real honor and privilege to be here. My question is about the United States' growing relationship with India over the past many administrations, and a number of the distinguished speakers have referenced this, including the Quad. So my question is, how do you see the strategic relationship developing under the new administration, both in terms of shared security interests in the region, but also beyond? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Wendy, do you want to respond?
I was going to say, if Nick is back on, he might want to, since he did, is he?
No, Nick actually is hosting a different event. Nick
Okay.
had to step out.
I think that, Gopal, that everybody understands that India is absolutely critical. And I engaged in a discussion the other day with some Japanese colleagues, and everything was about the Quad. Everything was about the US, India, Australia relationship and trying to ensure security in the Indo-Pacific, whatever you want to call the region of the world. I think we're all now going to start using Indo-Pacific. And so I think it's quite crucial. Now, Gopal, you may know even better than I do that it's a complicated relationship. And although we all hoped that Prime Minister Modi would really underpin the democracy of India and its great history, there have been some challenges to human rights issues in India. There have been challenges around how strong that democracy will be, about the business and the defense relationships with the United States. But I think we have a lot more in common than we have different. And so I would see a deepening of that relationship. And I think you will see a lot of attention paid to who becomes the ambassador to India, because it is a very key, critical security and economic relationship. Jason and Joe might have something they want to say about that, particularly when it comes to climate and when it comes to our economic relationship.
Thank you. I should just mention that the current US ambassador to India is in fact a Kennedy School alumnus and supporter of students at the Kennedy School over time. Joe, do you want to say something about India and climate change?
Sure. I'll just note that India at times over the past really sort of 15, almost 20 years has been sometimes fairly easy to work with and sometimes quite challenging to work with in international climate negotiations. I think what's more important, though, is that in recent years, they have charted out a path to become quite ambitious in the deployment of renewable resources, especially solar power. This is, in a way, something similar to what we're seeing in the US, where they've pushed out a lot of solar that's starting to displace coal, because they do have a fair amount of coal and a fair amount of coal sector employment in India. So I think there's opportunities here where we look at not just what we do at the international negotiations, but how do we work on a bilateral basis to think about where there are economic opportunities to continue to push out the renewables, perhaps continue to push those out in a way that helps enable greater access to electricity, which is important when they think about their economic development. It's also important when they think about their near term and in some of their largest cities, quite critical challenge of trying to deal with air pollution. Sometimes when we focus on climate change and we're thinking longer term, we have a luxury in the sense that we've already done a lot to clean up our local air pollution, but in some of the major developing and emerging economies, local air pollution is a more serious and immediate public health challenge. There's ways we can try to tailor our policy response and our engagement with India to ensure that we get near-term benefits in terms of the local public health and long-term benefits for the global climate.
Thank you very much, Joe. Why don't we go to our next question, which is from Martin Lugenbuehl. Martin, please.
Thank you, Dean Elmendorf. Thank you, everyone on this panel. And sorry, maybe this is another one for Ambassador Sherman, who doesn't seem to get a break today. It's on the relationship with Europe. And I was reading an article just recently where it seems Mick Mulvaney, official of the White House, seems to think we reached a point of no return in terms of that relationship between the US and Europe. Do you agree with that? Or would you think that through the various maybe measures or initiatives we mentioned on this call, there might be a way to go back to the stage we were at, maybe say under Obama, for example. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. If Nick were still on the screen, I'm sure he would say he has had the same experience I have had, which is many, many emails and text messages and WhatsApp messages from friends in Europe and around the world saying, hi, we're so excited. We can't wait. And that's not to say that everybody won't have a little wariness. Everybody will have a little wariness. And I should have mentioned earlier, just as we are internally focused to deal with our own issues of COVID, economic restoration, racial justice, every other country around the world has the same thing. They are focused. Europe, you know better than I, is very internally focused, and they have Brexit on top of everything else and trying to figure out what their way is forward economically. So we all have a lot of internal work to do. It'll make the process of re-engagement a little bit more awkward. And there is wariness because of the years, but I am very optimistic. We will be stronger in alliance with Europe, and I am sure we will be back together again. You saw Boris Johnson, who's been incredibly close to President Trump, welcome the president-elect, and I'm sure he's already looking forward to what he might derive out of the relationship.
Thank you, Wendy. Let me slip in a question. We'll come to you in a moment, Danielle, but we had some questions that came in ahead of time. And one this is for you, Juliette, that struck me was in addition to dealing with the current pandemic, what is it that we have learned or should have learned, should be learning from this current experience that we should then use to build a more resilient society for future, in the anticipation of possible future pandemics? What's the longer term agenda here? You're muted, Juliette.
So I think on the prevention side, obviously transparency, a stronger health surveillance system, stronger public health systems, and there is no time but the present. I mean, in other words, what we're looking at is we had from basically January to March to ensure that we try to stop community spread. Every country's dates were a little bit different. I think what we learned is there's only one wrong answer and it's too late. That's the wrong answer. So I think that we'll, in terms of just sort of prevention of the kind of scope and magnitude we have, there of course will be questions about supply chain and issues about our capacity to supply a 50-state, here in the US, a 50-state catastrophe, which is what we're facing now. I'm more anxious. I don't get anxious, but I'm more excited about where we are now as compared to any other round, either March or June, because this one has no epicenter, and you're seeing that in the numbers. I think long-term it's going to be very interesting. I mean, one, of course, is serious discussions about healthcare and access to healthcare, about the equitable distribution of healthcare and throughout the world. Questions about how we live and how we work. Asia is starting to see almost 100% return to offices. I may be wrong, but I think that might not be true for the US and certainly Western Europe. How we transport and whether we move. So you're going to talk, we might be talking about generations in the exurbs, not the suburbs. And then women and work. One of my pieces, I've been a columnist, a contributor to the Atlantic through this. They asked me to start writing in March when they saw my more.
Oh, so you're frozen there, Juliette. Let's hope this is just a momentary glitch.
As Jason certainly knows the impact on the service industries, but for working women, white collar women as well, we did not treat our schools as critical infrastructure, and our priorities as a nation differ than the priorities of Europe. Even as they go back into lockdown, they are keeping their schools open. the numbers from Goldman Sachs and others are distressing. The number of women who are leaving the workforce permanently, or at least for the time being. And so we have to have a serious discussion about our schools and children and women in work that hopefully will amount to recognizing that the burdens of our negligence towards protecting our children and our education systems are not falling on men and women equally. So those are some, I mean, I say that as good news, like these, out of every crisis, as we say in crisis management, the devil only wins if we don't do better next time. And I actually believe that. So.
Thank you very much, Juliette. And now we have a question from Danielle Porfido. Danielle, please.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity to ask this question. Last week, the dean hosted a post-election discussion that really talked a lot about polarization in this country. And I wonder what all of you think that the polarized environment that we're living in, what effect will that have on the Biden and Harris administration's ability to do policymaking, and then to look ahead to build Democratic power in the 2022 and then 2024 election period?
Doug, I'm happy to start.
Yes, please.
I was in the Obama administration, and for 8 years we had a Congress of the other party. That's a real possibility for President Biden in his first 2 years, depending on what happens in Georgia. And my view is you have to do two things simultaneously that go in opposite directions. One is you have this set of things you want to do. You can no longer do that set right now. You can maybe just do that set. And so do that set, the set that is overlap. To get to the set that has overlap, you're going to have to give up things that are painful to you and make compromises. And, I think the other side often has all sorts of bad intentions and is insincere, et cetera. I think they also often have like a different view about how the economy functions or society functions, et cetera. And what you need to do is figure out how to solve that for that. I think I've been in the room with President Biden as Vice President Biden as he negotiated with then Majority Leader McConnell. And I think they're pretty good at doing that together, expanding the bounds. I think a good example of that right now is the relief package and stimulus. To say that McConnell and Trump are so against it, it'll never happen, makes you feel good. You can rail against them, blame them, it's all their fault, they're obstructionists, they're terrible, they're horrible. You didn't help anyone though, and people need help right now. So the much harder, more challenging thing to do is how can I solve their problem? How can I maybe do less than I wanted? How can I give them something they need? Maybe for political reasons, maybe for substantive reasons, because they're right and I'm wrong. And so not just sort of petulantly blowing everything up because the other side can't agree, figuring out how to get them to agree. That's part of what you need to do, is get things done for the sake of the country. The other part is build the case for the other things that you can't get done right now and explain to people, help them understand the importance, flesh them out. And you need to do sort of that fighting for your ideas on the one side and the compromising to getting things done on the other side. And that's harder today than it was before with polarization, but you can't just throw your hands up and say, polarization, I give up. You have to say, how do I make the best of it? And it's not easy, but it's worth trying.
Mm-hmm.
And can I build on this question about polarization and turn to you, Sandra? So one of the ways in which we seem to be increasingly polarized is the city folk versus the country folk. And you are an expert on a set of issues involving urban areas, poverty, joblessness, social networks, and so on. And so we've had a president who seems to take particular enjoyment in saying bad things about cities and the people who live in them. But he didn't invent some differences in the voting patterns of people in cities versus rural areas. He didn't invent significant differences in the way life is lived. How do you think about the Biden-Harris administration? I presume trying to give weight to the lives and needs of people in cities without forgetting the lives and needs of people who live in other areas. Do you have any sense about how that they might be able to heal America, as President-elect Biden has said, in a way that would help on that, along that schism?
That's a great question, and it's not something I've thought a great deal about. We know that within the context of cities, even thriving cities, inequality is huge. I mean, San Francisco is a great city to live in, unless you don't have the resources to pay for rent for $3,200 for rent for a one-bedroom apartment. And so a lot of attention, I think, does need to be paid to those areas as well. But to be honest with you, the things that I think that the Biden-Harris administration should be thinking about and discussing at length, and this is less about how to think about the urban-rural divide, and it's back to the question of criminal justice, is really how to break in the minds of Americans this idea that the criminal legal system represents the solution to most of our social and economic problems, that we resolve these issues by going to the criminal justice system. And instead to really kind of build up and enhance institutions that can really take on the issues that many Americans face, because we no longer provide a really strong and stable social welfare system. It's in good part because of that we find people struggling, and then we address the struggles with the criminal legal system. And so generally speaking, I think both to use the power of the pulpit to pull apart this idea that we solve problems with the criminal justice system and that incarceration is the primary solution to crime, and instead to focus on these other institutions would be one path forward, and to put the money where your mouth is, or at least attempt to put the money where your mouth is by negotiating so as to invest in these institutions. And we're already partway there, right? The defund conversation is about kind of building up other institutions that have been ignored for the past basically 50 years. So this is what we're talking about. But I don't think we can end there. I mean, the truth of the matter is, over the last 40 or 50 years, because of the approach that we've taken to criminal justice, we have essentially decimated very specific communities across the country. In every city, we can identify those neighborhoods where most of the inmates come from. Right? And so if you're in New York, you know that there are 5 neighborhoods that from which men and women fill up the prisons in upstate New York, right? And they're all located in Brooklyn and in Bronx, et cetera. And you can do that across the country. Even as we move away from the most punitive policies, we still have to go back to those communities and make them whole. We have with just brutal set of policies, and in some cases intention, ruined communities. And I think that we do need to do the work of reinvesting in those communities, and it's the equivalent of reparations, right? So we need to make those communities whole. And then we need to invest in those communities in ways that's paying you for the harm done. Then we also need to invest in ways that allow those communities to build up so that they don't have the levels of crime, et cetera, violence that we're concerned about, in which case you don't need that much police presence. And so if we did invest in schools, if we did invest in parks and recreation, if we did invest in providing access to good jobs so that people could take care of themselves, and then stable supports through a strong welfare system, we wouldn't have the kinds of problems that we say bring police to these communities. And so you would, in the end, produce a lot less conflict that we've been seeing. But that requires breaking this kind of connection between problems in the criminal justice system. It requires repairing this damage that we've seen. And then it requires the investment that, to be honest, generations of white folks have received, and that Black and Latino folks have often been ignored, disconnected from. Those investments need to be made in those communities so that they can start to thrive in the ways that a number of communities across the country are thriving, and we take that thriving for granted. So that's how I'll respond to your question. Slightly changes it, but.
That's very, very helpful and important, Sandra. Thank you very much. I think among all the comments that have been made, there's come to a very clear sense of big challenges, at home for the United States and in the US interactions with our friends and sometimes competitors around the world. Some big challenges, but also I think a sense that there are paths to take, that there are real things that can be done by the incoming Biden-Harris administration that can improve the lives of Americans and of other people around the world. And we hope that those paths are pursued. I want to thank Sandra Susan Smith, Juliette Kayyem, Jason Furman, Joe Aldy, Wendy Sherman, and Nick Burns for a really extraordinary hour and a half. And I want to thank all of you who've come to watch me part of this for your coming. And I'll just mention we have some Dean's discussions at the Kennedy School coming up in the next few weeks and events hosted by the research centers on all sorts of topics. So please keep coming back. And in the meantime, take care of yourselves. Be safe. Bye-bye.